The dim lights of the house were mandatory, and the paintings appreciated in full, added to almost nightly when some vampire brought a new engraving or picture by a contemporary artist into the house. Celeste, with her cold hand on my arm, spoke with contempt of men as the originators of these pictures, and Estelle, who now held Claudia on her lap, emphasized to me, the naive colonial, that vampires had not made such horrors themselves, but merely collected them, confirming over and over that men were capable of far greater evil than vampires. "There is evil in making such paintings?" Claudia asked softly in her toneless voice. Celeste threw back her curls and laughed. "What can be imagined can be done," she answered quickly, but her eyes reflected a certain contained hostility. "Of course, we strive to rival men in kills of all kinds, do we not?" She leaned forward and touched Claudia's knee, but Claudia merely looked at her, watching her laugh nervously and continue. Santiago drew near, to bring up the subject of our rooms in the Hotel St. Gabriel. "Frightfully unsafe," he said, with an exaggerated stage gesture of the hands, and he showed me a knowledge of those rooms which was amazing. He knew the chest in which we slept. It struck him as vulgar. "Come here," he said to me, with that near childlike simplicity he had evinced on the steps. "Live with us in such disguise is unnecessary. We have our guards. And tell me, where do you come from?" he said, dropping to his knees, his hands on the arm of my chair. "Your voice, I know that accent. Speak again." I was vaguely horrified at the thought of having an accent to my French, but this wasn't my immediate concern. He was strong-willed and blatantly possessive, throwing back at me an image of that possessiveness which was flowering in me more fully every moment. And meanwhile, the vampires around us talked on, Estelle explaining that black was the color for a vampire's clothes, that Claudia's lovely pastel dress was beautiful, but tasteless. "We blend in with the night," she said. "We have a funeral gleam." And now, bending her cheek next to Claudia's cheek, she laughed to soften her criticism, and Celeste laughed, and Santiago laughed, and the whole room seemed alive with unearthly tinkling laughter, preternatural voices echoing against the painted walls, rippling the feeble candle flames. "Ah, but to cover up such curls," said Celeste, now playing with Claudia's golden hair, and I realized what must have been obvious, that all of them had dyed their hair black, but for Armand, and it was that, along with the black clothes, that added to the disturbing impression that we were statues from the same chisel and paintbrush. I cannot emphasize too much how disturbed I was by that impression. It seemed to stir something in me deep inside, something I couldn't fully grasp. I found myself wandering away from them, to one of the narrow mirrors, and watching them all over my shoulder. Claudia gleamed like a jewel in their midst. So would that mortal boy who slept below. The realization was coming to me that I found them dull in some awful way. Dull, dull, everywhere that I looked. Their sparkling vampire eyes repetitious, their wit like a dull brass bell. Only the knowledge I needed distracted me from these thoughts. "The vampires of Eastern Europe," Claudia was saying. "Monstrous creatures. What have they to do with us?" "Revenants," Armand answered softly over the distance that separated them, playing on faultless preternatural ears to hear what was more muted than a whisper. The room fell silent. "Their blood is different, vile. They increase as we do, but without skill or care. In the old days," abruptly he stopped. I could see his face in the mirror. It was strangely rigid. "Oh, but tell us about the old days," said Celeste, her voice shrill at human pitch. There was something vicious in her tone. And now Santiago took up the same baiting manner. "Yes, tell us of the covens, and the herbs that would render us invisible," he smiled, "and the burnings at the stake." Armand fixed his eyes on Claudia. "Beware those monsters," he said, and calculatedly his eyes passed over Santiago and then Celeste. "Those revenants. They will attack you as if you were human." Celeste shuddered, uttering something in contempt, an aristocrat speaking of vulgar cousins who bear the same name. But I was watching Claudia, because it seemed her eyes were misted again as before. She looked away from Armand suddenly. The voices of the others rose again, affected party voices, as they conferred with one another on the night's kills, describing this or that encounter without a smattering of emotion, challenges to cruelty erupting from time to time like flashes of white lightning, a tall, thin vampire being accosted in one corner for a needless romanticizing of mortal life, a lack of spirit, a refusal to do the most entertaining thing in the moment that was available to him. He was simple, shrugging, slow at words, and would fall for long periods into a stupefied silence, as if near choked with blood. He would as soon have gone to his coffin as remained here, and yet he remained, held by the pressure of this unnatural group held by the pressure of this unnatural group who had made of immortality a conformists' club. How would Lestat have found it, had he been here? What had caused him to leave? No one had dictated to Lestat. He was master of his small circle. But now they would have praised his inventiveness, his cat-like toying with his victims. And waste, that word, that value which had been all-important to me as a fledgling vampire, was spoken of often. "You wasted the opportunity to kill this child. You wasted the opportunity to frighten this poor woman, or drive that man to madness, which only a little prestidigitation would have accomplished." Prestidigitation, I know that from Dungeons & Dragons. There we go, I think I got it right there. My head was spinning, a common mortal headache. I longed to get away from these vampires, and only the distant figure of Armand held me, despite his warnings. He seemed remote from the others now, though he nodded often enough and uttered a few words here and there so that he seemed a part of them, his hand only occasionally rising from the lion's paw of his chair, and my heart expanded when I saw him this way, saw that no one amongst the small throng caught his glance as I caught his glance, and no one held it from time to time as I held it. Yet he remained aloof from me, his eyes alone returning to me. His warning echoed in my ears, yet I disregarded it. I longed to get away from the theatre altogether, and stood listlessly, garnering information at last that was useless and infinitely dull. "But there is no crime amongst you, no cardinal crime?" Claudia asked, her violet eyes seeming fixed on me, even in the mirror, as I stood with my back to her. "Crime! Boredom!" cried out Estelle, and she pointed a white finger at Armand. He laughed softly with her from his distant position at the end of the room. "Boredom is death!" she cried, and bared her vampire fangs, so that Armand put a languid hand to his forehead in a stage gesture of fear and falling. But Santiago, who was watching with his hands behind his back, intervened. "Crime?" he said. "Yes, there is a crime for which we would hunt another vampire down until we destroyed him. Can you guess what it is?" He glanced from Claudia to me and back again to her mask-like face. "You should know, who are so secretive about the vampire that made you." "And why is that?" she asked, her eyes widening ever so slightly, her hands resting still in her lap. A hush fell over the room, gradually then completely. All those white faces turned to face Santiago as he stood there, 1 foot forward, his hands clasped behind his back, towering over Claudia. His hands gleamed as he saw he had the floor, and then he broke away and crept up behind me, putting his hand on my shoulder. "Can you guess what the crime is? Didn't your vampire master tell you?" And drawing me slowly around with those invading familiar hands, he tapped my heart lightly in time with its quickening pace. "It is the crime that means death to any vampire, anywhere, who commits it. It is to kill your own kind." "Ah!" Claudia cried out, and lapsed into peals of laughter. Oh, sorry, she should be laughing there. She was walking across the floor now with swirling lavender silk and crisp resounding steps. Taking my hand, she said, "I was so afraid. It was to be born like Venus out of the foam, as we were. Master Vampire, come, Louis, let's go." She beckoned as she pulled me away. Armand was laughing. Santiago was still, and it was Armand who rose when we reached the door. "You're welcome tomorrow night," he said, "and the night after." I don't think I caught my breath until I'd reached the street. The rain was still falling, and all of the street seemed sodden and desolate in the rain, but beautiful. A few scattered bits of paper blowing in the wind, a gleaming carriage passing slowly with the thick rhythmic clop of the horse. The sky was pale violet. I sped fast, with Claudia beside me leading the way, then finally frustrated with the length of my stride, riding in my arms. "I don't like them," she said to me with steel fury as we neared the Hotel St. Gabriel. Even its immense, brightly lit lobby was still in the pre-dawn hour. I spirited past the sleepy clerks, the long faces at the desk. "I've searched for them the world over, and I despise them." She threw off her cape and walked into the center of the room. A volley of rain hit the French windows. I found myself turning up the lights one by one and lifting the candelabrum to the gas flames as if I were Lestat or Claudia. And then, seeking the puce velvet chair I'd envisioned in that cellar, I slipped down into it, exhausted. It seemed for the moment as if the room blazed about me. As my eyes fixed on a gilt-framed painting of pastel trees and serene waters, the vampire spell was broken. They couldn't touch us here, and yet I knew this to be a lie. A foolish lie. "I am in danger. Danger," Claudia said with that smoldering wrath. "But how can we know what..." I think that's Claudia speaking. "But how can we know what... How do they know what we did to him? Besides, we are in danger. Do you think for a moment I don't acknowledge my own guilt? And if you were the only one..." I reached out now for her as she drew near, but her fierce eyes settled on me and I let my hands drop back limp. "Do you think I would leave you in danger?" She was smiling. For a moment I didn't believe my eyes. "No, you would not, Louis. You would not. Danger holds you to me." "Love holds me to you," I said softly. "Love," she mused. "What do you mean by love?" And then, as if she could see the pain in my face, she came close and put her hands on my cheek. She was cold, unsatisfied as I was cold and unsatisfied, teased by that mortal boy, but unsatisfied. "That you take my love for granted always," I said to her. "That we are wed." But even as I said these words, I felt my old conviction waver. I felt that torment I'd felt last night when she had taunted me about mortal passion. I turned away from her. "You would leave me for Armand if he beckoned you." "Never," I said to her. "You would leave me, and he wants you as you want him. He's been waiting for you." "Never." I rose now and made my way to that chest. The doors were locked, and they would not keep those vampires out. Only we could keep them out by rising as early as the light would let us. I turned to her and told her to come, and she was by my side. I wanted to bury my face in her hair. I wanted to beg her forgiveness, because, in truth, she was right. And yet I loved her as always, and now as I drew her in close to me, she said, "Do you know what it was that he told me over and over without ever speaking a word? Do you know what was the kernel of the trance he put me in, so my eyes could only look at him, so that he pulled me as if my heart were on a string?" "So you felt it," I whispered. "So it was the same." "He rendered me powerless," she said. I saw the image of her against those books above his desk, her limp neck, her dead hands. "But what are you saying? That he spoke to you, that he—" "Without words," she repeated. I could see the gaslights going dim, the candle flames too solid in their stillness. The rain beat on the panes. "Do you know what he said?" "That I should die," she whispered. "That I should let you go." I shook my head, and yet in my monstrous heart I felt a surge of excitement. She spoke the truth as she believed it. There was a film in her eyes, glassy and silver. "He draws life out of me into himself," she said, her lovely lips trembling so I couldn't bear it. I held her tight, but the tears stood in her eyes. "Life out of the boy who is his slave. Life out of me whom he would make his slave. He loves you. He loves you, he would have you, and he would not have me stand in the way." "You don't understand him." I fought it, kissing her. I wanted to shower her with kisses, her cheek, her lips. "No, I understand him only too well," she whispered to my lips, even as they kissed her. "It is you who don't understand him. Love's blinded you, your fascination with his knowledge, his power. If you knew how he drinks death, you'd hate him more than you ever hated Lestat, Louis. You must never return to him. I tell you, I'm in danger." Early the next night I left her, convinced that Armand, alone among the vampires of the theatre, could be trusted. She let me go reluctantly, and I was troubled, deeply by the expression in her eyes. Weakness was unknown to her, and yet I saw fear and something beaten even now as she let me go, and I hurried on my mission, waiting outside the theatre until the last of the patrons had gone and the doormen were tending to the locks. What they thought I wasn't certain. An actor like the others who did not take off his paint? It didn't matter. What mattered was that they let me through, and I passed them and the few vampires in the ballroom unaccosted to stand at last at Armand's open door. He saw me immediately, no doubt had heard my step a long way off, and he welcomed me at once and asked me to sit down. He was busy with his human boy, who was dining at the desk on a silver plate of meats and fish. A decanter of white wine stood next to him, and though he was feverish and weak from last night, his skin was florid, and his heat and fragrance were a torment to me. Not apparently to Armand, who sat in the leather chair by the fire opposite me, turned to the human, his arms folded on the leather arm. The boy filled his glass and held it up now in a salute. "My master," he said, his eyes flashing on me as he smiled. But the toast was to Armand. "Your slave," Armand whispered with a deep intake of breath that was passionate, and he watched as the boy drank deeply. I could see him savoring the wet lips, the mobile flesh of the throat as the wine went down, and now the boy took a morsel of white meat, making that same salute, and consumed it slowly, his eyes fixed on Armand. It was as though Armand feasted upon the feast, drinking in that part of life which he could not share any longer except with his eyes. And lost though he seemed to it, it was calculated, not that torture I'd felt years ago when I stood outside Babette's window longing for her human life. When the boy had finished, he knelt with his arms around Armand's neck as if he actually savored the icy flesh, and I could remember the night Lestat first came to me, how his eyes seemed to burn, how his white face gleamed. You know what I am to you now. Finally it was finished. He was to sleep, and Armand locked the brass gate against him. and in minutes, heavy with his meal, he was dozing, and Armand sat opposite me, his large, beautiful eyes tranquil and seemingly innocent. When I felt them pull me towards him, I dropped my eyes, wished for a fire in the grate, but there were only ashes. You told me to say nothing of my origin. Why was this? I asked, looking up at him. It was as if he could sense my holding back, yet he wasn't offended, only regarding me with a slight wonder. But I was weak, too weak for his wonder, and again I looked away from him. Did you kill this vampire who made you? Is that why you are here without him? Why won't you say his name? Santiago thinks that you did it. And if this is true, or if we can't convince you otherwise, you would try to destroy us, I asked. I would not try to do anything to you, he said calmly. But as I told you, I am not the leader here in the sense that you asked. Yet they believe you to be the leader, don't they? And Santiago, you shoved him away from me twice. I'm more powerful than Santiago, older. Santiago is younger than you are, he said. His voice was simple, devoid of pride. These were facts. We want no quarrel with you. It's begun, he said, but not with me, with those above. But what reason has he to suspect us? He seemed to be thinking now, his eyes cast down, his chin resting on his closed fist. After a while, which seemed interminable, he looked up. I could give you reasons, he said, that you are too silent, that the vampires of the world are a small number and live in terror of strife amongst themselves, and choose their fledglings with great care, making certain that they respect the other vampires mightily. There are 15 vampires in this house, and the number is jealously guarded, and the weak vampires are feared. I should say this also. That you are flawed is obvious to them. You feel too much. You think too much. As you said yourself, vampire detachment is not of great value to you. And then there is this mysterious child, a child who can never grow, never be self-sufficient. I would not make a vampire of that boy there, now if his life, which is so precious to me, were in serious danger, because he is too young, his limbs not strong enough, his mortal cup barely tasted. Yet you bring with you this child. What manner of vampire made her, they ask. Did you make her? So you see, you bring with you these flaws and this mystery, and yet you are completely silent. And so you cannot be trusted. And Santiago looks for an excuse. But there is another reason closer to the truth than all these things which I've just said to you. And that is simply this, that when you first encountered Santiago in the Latin Quarter, you, unfortunately, called him a buffoon. I sat back. It would perhaps have been better all around if you had said nothing, and he smiled to see that I understood with him the irony of this. I sat reflecting upon what he'd said, and what weighed as heavily upon me through all of it were Claudia's strange admonitions, that this gentle-eyed young man had said to her, "Die," and beyond that my slowly accumulating disgust with the vampires in the ballroom above. I felt an overwhelming desire to speak to him of these things, of her fear. No, not yet, though I couldn't believe when I looked into his eyes that he'd tried to wield this power over her. His eyes said, "Live." His eyes said, "Learn." And oh, how much I wanted to confide to him the breadth of what I didn't understand. How searching all these years I'd been astonished to discover those vampires above had made of immortality a club of fads and cheap conformity. And yet through this sadness, this confusion, came the clear realization. Why should it be otherwise? What had I expected? What right had I to be so bitterly disappointed in Lestat that I would let him die? Because he wouldn't show me what I must find in myself? Armand's words, what had they been? The only power that exists is inside ourselves. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Alright, so that is another section of Interview with the Vampire. Some very, very sloppy mistakes on my part today, so I apologize with that. There were some confusingly laid out sentences, but also I just mixed up my words occasionally, so not much that can be done in regards to that. I could go back and edit it, but that's not really the vibe this series is going for. Regardless, let's talk about some of the cool things that happened today. The first thing I want to address is, you'll remember when I was talking about the Eastern European vampires, I said that there was a line coming up that is the most yikes regarding this, and that is, I'm sure you identified it as it came up, where Armand confirms very explicitly that the Eastern European vampires are of an objectively lesser blood than their own. Whether or not this is true doesn't particularly matter, because it shows very clear racial implications in the view of Western vampires, where the Western vampires consider themselves, and indeed kind of objectively are, by the way the story lays itself out, superior. They have intelligence, they have their wits about them, they can actually operate, whereas the Eastern European vampires are just lesser in every way. And we can only assume that perhaps they aren't, like, this is just Armand being racist, and they're not actually of objectively lesser blood, and it's more in line with Claudia's theory, but it still is very indicative of the mindset of these Western vampires. They're very, very racist, which I'm sure you've gathered by this stage. Anyway, cool things regarding the sort of life as a vampire in the theatre, where Louis observes that the vampires of the theatre have made immortality into a club of conformity, where they're all acting in similar ways, they're dressing the same, they've all dyed their hair black, and they have very specific standards about how they should hunt and kill and operate. And I think what this all appears to be is it's all part of that same moral structure I identified in previous episodes, where this conformity is all designed to reinforce the moral view of the world in which they are conscious death, and to justify their actions in terms of a purpose they have assigned themselves. One of the vampires remarks that boredom is death, and this is quite literal, because if they lose purpose, then, as we've seen from Armand, vampires tend to kill themselves. If they if they sort of start delving too deep into meaninglessness and self-conflict, and they don't just engage in whatever behavior they're doing with very, rigid moralistic determination, then they, lose the will to live. So boredom is very literally death in this regard. And the only one who deviates from this rigid conformity is Armand himself, and I think that just shows his authority over the others more than it shows anything else, because Armand is powerful enough to not have to conform. And when we look at the behavior of the vampires in the theatre, they goad and taunt each other as a method of ensuring social conformity in this kind of ever-increasing monstrosity, where, much like Lestat and his view, they focus very much on specific details of the kill and maximizing their enjoyment of kills through cruelty and, ironic jokes towards the people they're killing. And anyone who maintains any semblance of sentimentalism will be goaded and taunted until they abandon such precepts, as we see done in regards to the tall vampire that Louis describes. And Louis threatens this moral structure, and he threatens this social order within the theatre, because he is starting to abandon the view of monstrosity as acceptable. He's not quite there yet, and who knows, maybe he'll never even reach it, but he's starting to doubt the way he previously operated. He's starting to realize that it wasn't okay to just pretend that nothing meant anything so that he can do anything he wants. And this threatens their order, because they're in the same position he was in functionally. And so they're very, very scared of him, and they're very, very angry at him at the same time. But there are more reasons to be angry at Louis, I think. It's also implied that Claudia's existence is something that is making people suspicious of Louis. This is interesting because obviously Armand listed as one of the things that vampires don't really like. It's something they go against because children have never had a full potential to experience mortal life. Which just shows, I think, that some of the moral standards of mortality remain within them, even though they claim to have adopted this monstrous conscious death, completely indiscriminate view of the world. They still have something against turning children into vampires, which again I think just highlights the inherent hypocrisy of the way they're viewing the world, and Louis is rejecting that, but again that's also making him a threat. And the fact that he has a child vampire with him makes them think he made a child a vampire, and it makes them mad at him. So that's another reason. And of course there's the fact that they suspect he has killed his creator. They suspect that Louis has been involved in the murder of Lestat, that they don't. Well, actually, Santiago kind of knows about Lestat, and they, I assume, met Lestat before this. So, it's interesting to consider that the biggest vampiric sin is killing another vampire. Because it presents this world of kind of vampiric solidarity, which I think reaffirms the notion I've touched on a few times throughout this reading, where vampires view themselves as this kind of unique and superior class/race, depending on who's talking. They distinctly view themselves as above mortals. They view themselves as superior creatures. And Louis believed this, Lestat fervently believed this. Louis kind of was moving away from that belief when he was talking to Armand in the last part, where he referred to human consciousness as the highest form, which lumped vampires and mortals in together as this, similar phenomenon. So Louis is actually moving away from this view, and hopefully he'll get better at it. But generally, all the other vampires view themselves as distinctly superior beings. And yet, at the same time, they present this outward facade of vampiric solidarity amongst themselves. But they also fight amongst themselves very readily. As Armand reveals, Santiago is verging on murdering Louis from a single insult. There are all the other perceived threats that Louis offers, but one of the main things that got Santiago wanting to kill Louis was the fact that he insulted him and threatened his position in vampiric society, I suppose, by his arrival. That's another cool thing to consider, and we'll see more about that as the story develops. Another thing I have noted down here is I was talking about Armand's servant, the last part, and I was talking about the notion of consent to vampiric feeding, and the fact that it is better than killing, but still pretty morally bad. And at that time, I had completely forgotten, and I'm still kind of confused on this as I'm reading. The text doesn't make it as clear as it really should, and that makes me kind of worried because it may be intentionally obfuscating these kind of things to make it less horrible to read. But it seems to be implied that Armand's servant is a child. I was assuming that when Louis said boy, he was referring to a young man, like sort of very late teens, early 20s. But he appears to be at least pubescent. We learn that from the biological function he engages in the previous part. So from the implications here, it seems like the child is like mid-teens, like 15, 16 at most, which just makes it worse, to be honest. It makes feeding on him not only immoral from the standard of, feeding on and manipulating and abusing another human being, it is immoral from the sense that it is pedophilic in its nature of being sexual actions in relation to a child. Or, technically not pedophilic, but I don't care. It's pedophilic. So yeah, there's that. I can't tell. The text doesn't make it as clear, or maybe I'm just not reading it right, but I'm getting the implications that they're like mid-teens. And I'm going to hope I'm wrong, and I'm going to hope that I've missed a clear line where it states the boy is like 21. Because that would make me a lot happier. Anyway, we'll ignore that for now. Very, very relevant to bring up, and it does change a degree of the character of Armand, but worth noting. Okay, so we have, again, back onto Armand and Armand's fascination with Louis. And I think we see here hinted from Claudia that Armand's fascination with Louis stems primarily from the way that Louis views the world. Armand has kind of heard Louis out. He's heard Louis's description of this moral framework he's kind of messing around with, in which he is actually, considering, he's realized that he doesn't have to be an asshole. Louis has gotten like 1% of the way to breaking free of this vampiric cycle of abuse. And Armand sees this, and it fascinates him because Armand, I think, internally realizes that his current position is untenable, that eventually he can't keep up this faux immorality forever. He will eventually get tired of lying to himself. And what Louis offers is an escape from this self-ascribed meaninglessness and immorality and nihilism, and Armand wants to possess that. He wants to take Louis and possess him and use him as an object of fascination from which he can learn about his mysterious ways and perhaps not accept them, but find them intriguing enough to maintain his motivation to keep going. Which is, of course, ironic, because in doing so he would violate the very tenets that Louis is starting to understand. And we'll see how well that goes for him as the text progresses. But everyone wants to possess each other in this novel. Whenever a vampire is talking about love, what they really mean is obsession and ownership. Nobody loves each other in this text, and I'm going to say that very, very explicitly. There is no love between these characters. They are all unhealthy, abusive, gaslighting, manipulative monsters. And there's nothing cute about it. And the way that Louis and Armand and Claudia and Lestat talk about each other as though they were in love. They aren't. They are manipulating and abusive, because if they truly loved each other, they would not put each other through such torment and such monstrosity, and they would seek good things and seek to be better people so that they can free themselves from the cycle of abuse they perpetuate through their actions. But yeah, Claudia is seeing this, and he's seeing Armand. She's seeing. Sorry, I went on a tangent there. But Claudia is seeing Armand's growing possession of Louis, and she's seeing that Louis is starting to kind of fall under Armand's control in much the same way that he prior fell under her control from Lestat. And she wants to maintain control over Louis, but she's seeing the writing on the wall a little bit here. And it seems like she's first of all using the physical affection as a method of trying to reassert that control, and when that doesn't work fully, it seems like she's going to start and try making plans for future methods of protecting herself. So we'll see how that develops as the plot continues. But really interesting section there. Some really cool things. Some yikes, some not great stuff that I'm a bit iffy on. But overall, some really cool things as well. So I hope you enjoyed that section, and I'll see you again tomorrow for another 10 pages of Interview with the Vampire.